Hey reader, this is Centaur here, and today we're doing something that's a little different for the channel. We haven't done any of these types of videos yet, but for those who are familiar with the Tell Me a Tale Middle-earth Strategy Battle Game blog, which I've been helping to host for the last 12 and a half years or so, you know that I'm the guy who contributes the top 10 ranking articles. And so I got to be honest, it wasn't long before I told myself, we're probably going to have to do some top 10 videos tied to bolt action. And so today I want to start off with a video that's relatively straightforward, which is my top 10 recommendations ranked from number 10 to number 1 on which vehicles you might consider taking with the Panzer Ace option in the Armies of Germany 3rd edition supplement. Okay. Now, this rule book with this, it introduced the concept of Panzer Ace, and we're going to walk through the requirements of what you have to take and what Panzer Ace does on the next slide. Okay, but there's a few things that I should mention. Okay, first of all, technically. There's only 9, okay? But, the concept here is to get an idea from a math-driven perspective, not just a gut feeling or instinctive feeling, but a math-driven perspective on what your best options are, okay? Now, that being said, purely math-driven, as you'll see when we break down how we're ranking everything, there are some assumptions that go into this, and some of those assumptions may be completely wrong as a way of looking at stuff. I'm also honest, I'm going to try to remain unbiased, but I do have some tanks that I like better than others. So there is a likelihood that when I was sitting down fleshing out what I thought was needed and would make a tank more effective in this role, I might have been leaning and skewing already away from some items. Okay, so I'm going to try to be objective and try to be unbiased. That's the whole point of doing math-driven stuff. But I'm also honest, there's a lot of different factors that you might consider. So to start off with, what are our metrics and our requirements? Okay, so for starters, we're going to be grading them on 7 different areas, which I feel is nice because it gives you a lot of variety depending on what it is that you value in something. Okay, and some may be stronger in some areas and weaker in others. Nobody's ever going to get a maximum score because you'd have to pay points in order to get firepower, as one example. So the first one we're going to look at is the opportunity cost. So basically, a perfect score of 5 means that you cost 200 points or less, which I don't think is anything on this list. So there's that to start with. But for every 50 points beyond 200 points, you drop your score by 1. You'll be ranked on a score from 1 to 5, and we can do halves. So, it's possible that a person may not get quite as high, and that's fine. But generally speaking, cheaper things are going to have a higher score. More expensive things are going to have a lower score in this specific category. Okay. Second thing we're going to look at is infantry removal. So you get 1 point to a maximum of 5 for each machine gun and high explosive template option that you have. This means that for most of them, you're going to be looking at, at least 2 in each category because you're probably going to have like a forward-facing machine gun, as you can see on that. I believe it's a Tiger over there in the picture. And then some sort of big gun. And your big gun will either have an HE template, which, overwhelmingly they all would, or they're going to have a coaxial machine gun at the very least, right? That's going to check in on it. But either way, each of those would count as 1. And then you'd have another one coming from the hull-mounted machine gun, and so that would give you at least 2 points, okay? We're then going to break down armor removal into 2 categories. The first is how good it is at removing light armor, because some weapons, like light autocannons, for example, fire an awful lot of shots, but they really are only good at trying to pin, possibly remove light armor, but they aren't really good at heavy armor. So the way this works is that if you have a penetration of at least +2, that counts as 1 point. If your main armament was a heavy machine gun, it would give you no points because I don't think an HMG would even be very good at removing damage value 7, let alone damage value 8. Okay. And then you get an extra +1 for each penetration beyond that. And then, of course, there's a penalty for hull-mounted main guns. So if you have a chassis that doesn't have the ability to fire on a turret, which can easily track light armor, you're going to get a penalty to that one because light armor tends to be slightly faster. It tends to be more likely to have the recce rule. It's just a lot harder to headhunt things when you have to advance and turn instead of taking advantage of firing from the fire or ambush order. You then have serious armor removal. Serious armor removal starts at a pen +4 or lower, gets you a value of 1, because technically if you wrap around, you could probably remove something. Then for each pen beyond that, you get an extra point. And then, of course, thing to keep in mind is when we're looking at the Panzer Ace rule, we're going to get a bonus to our damage roll, right? So going up to a potential of pen +8 is actually possible on this, and our scoring system does allow for that to happen. We're then also going to look at durability. So, like, how punchy is the tank is one question, and that's what the three firepower categories are designed to represent. But also how durable it is should also weigh in. Now, this is part of where the math becomes problematic because we're weighting weapon systems in three different ways, and we're rating armor once. Okay, so I can already see it here. It is probably going to throw off some of the math, but I didn't find an easier way to be able to do this because in general, especially for the bigger weapons and with the change that they made to how pinning works against regular armored vehicles, there really isn't nearly as much of a difference now in terms of durability between a damage value 8 tank and a damage value 9 tank, which is my cutoff between light and serious armor from a defensive standpoint, because it's not like you're more likely to shed pins and take no pins at all unless you're taking it veteran. Now, of course, in our particular scenario here with Panzer Ace, we are. But as we look at other future top 10 rankings for armored vehicles, just know we're using a modification of these kinds of things present here. And so this is one of the things that we're going to be looking at is durability only in one category. And I think it's fine that way. And then finally, we're going to look at utility, special rules and stuff like that, as well as abilities. So utility would include things like how fast you move, right? Slow vehicles are not going to move nearly as fast. And that does have problems associated with it. You know, if you have tracked movement, that's better. You know, standard track movement, that's better than being slow. Half track movement's better than being tracked. And then wheeled movement is better than a bunch of the others. Is better than at least tracked movement. I don't know this is necessarily better than half track movement, but you can at least move faster. But again, all of these things are doing something different. And then if you do have a special rule or something else like that, command vehicle or some other special ability that doesn't easily conflate with damage potential or damage mitigation, we want to give at least room to be able to gauge those things. So all of these taken together are going to give us our stats for what we're looking at for how we gauge Panzer Aces, okay? And so to start us off at number 10, when we're looking at Panzer Ace, we have to remember, in fact, actually here, we'll just back up a little bit and we'll cut that part. So before we walk in, it's important to know what Panzer Ace does, okay? First of all, it only does two things. It's going to add a +1 to the damage roll of the tank that you give it to, and it's also going to add a +1 to the result on the damage chart. Both of which are really good for removal because it means that, you know, a medium anti-tank gun or a light anti-tank gun or something like that will punch harder than it normally would because your person is better able to align the shot in an area that's going to do more damage because of past experience with it. And the second thing that it does is that it's going to make it so that you're now destroying a vehicle on a 3+, and they're never just going down. They're going to go down while being immobilized, or they're going to go down while being on fire, as opposed to just going down. All of which is fantastic. And this means that a Panzer Ace tank is going to be a more efficient removal tool on the battlefield as long as you're fighting enemy armor, right? If you go up against a partisan force or a Norwegian force or a Greek force that didn't believe in running tiny vehicles that aren't contributing as much as, say, a machine gun team, then you might not get a lot of value out of a Panzer Ace. But short of those skew style lists, you're likely going to get better value out of it than if you were just running a standard one. Now, the trade-off for this, because this is not just a free upgrade, is you do have to take the vehicle at veterancy. So you are paying a premium, but you don't have to pay a premium on top of that in order to take Panzer Ace. The rule is just it has to be a veteran, okay? So as we start off the list, looking at number 9, the worst choice I think that you can take to fill this role is the Elephant, okay? Now, this is a super heavy anti-tank gun that also has a hull-mounted machine gun. Not particularly surprising. It's a relatively common pairing. It is a super heavy tank at damage value 11, so it is very difficult to remove. There are a good number of armies that won't even have a weapon system that can even try to roll a damage roll against this thing unless they're hitting it from the side, the rear, or the top. And that on its own is a really, really good advantage. The problem is because of the fact that it's a hull-mounted chassis for the gun, it is more likely to have to perform advance actions instead of fire actions, which means the real benefit of having an anti-tank gun, that extra +1 to hit when you're performing a fire action or an ambush action, which combines really nicely with the +1 to wound and the +1 to the damage chart, you are less likely to get. Okay, now there are some battlefields, obviously, where just because of how the board is laid out, you might find that the enemy kind of just has to move their tanks to certain places, and you could set this up in such a way as to be able to push them in that direction. You might have the benefit of out deploying them, so that way they have to place their armor first, and you can place your armor second. And it doesn't take too many hits with this thing to actually remove stuff, okay? But when we're looking at this in a vacuum, I have to admit, it is harder to get those hits on target, which is potentially problematic. The second issue that comes with this is because it's a super heavy anti-tank gun with that +7 to wound, and then you're getting a potential extra one for a +8 to wound, it means that against anything damage value 9 or lower, you're actually you're wasting some of the penetration that you paid for. And while that means that, yes, you are going to be wounding on twos, even at long range, you'd be wounding a damage value 9 vehicle on twos, which is not bad, with a 3+ chance to utterly destroy them, which is also not bad. It is a consideration, okay, that you have not optimized quite as well as you could have, okay? And then the fact that it's not very fast, and it doesn't do anything else extra for you. It's not like it's providing a benefit, an auric benefit to anybody else. For the amount of points you're spending, which is a lot, 463 points veteran, you're really not getting that much off of all of this. So, just being honest, the Ferdinand and then the larger upgraded gun, the Elephant, like they're fine. Don't get me wrong. They're fine vehicles. But I don't personally think this is a good choice for your Panzer Ace. I think you're paying way too many points for way too little value. Right above that, not surprisingly, is the Panzer VI Tiger II. The Tiger II performs a little bit better because it has some extra utility. It isn't a slow vehicle, so it will move faster, which means you can better chase enemies down. And the fact that it's turreted means that you have a better chance of just being able to perform fire actions, or ambush actions for that matter, instead of having to advance. So you are more likely to hit targets, still likely to do removal, and at damage value 11, you are still very durable. Right? It is going to be very difficult to actually take you out of the fight, which is good because you're about half or maybe under half, depending on whether you're playing at 1,000 or 1,250 points, just in the one tank. Okay, so it is definitely something to think about. That being said, you're also immune to most heavy weapons that people are likely to field in the game if they are trying to outdice you. So, like, there are trade-offs with this, and I can see advantages in taking this over the Elephant. But again, I do think that this is an awful lot of tools in one place, and all they have to do is just put their armor in another spot or run it behind some sort of line of sight blocking terrain, and you are going to have to try to headhunt with a Tiger, which is not necessarily what you want to do. Above that, and this might surprise some people because it's one of the cheaper options on the list, is the Panzer IV. Now, I thought for sure the Panzer IV was an easy in for like top 3. But it turns out, from a math perspective, it's actually not that good because you're paying quite a bit to be almost where you want to go with this thing, right? So you have a turret-mounted heavy anti-tank gun, which is fine. At 270 points, it's a little bit expensive in order to have a turret-mounted heavy AT gun, but you're a medium tank with a heavy AT gun. So you're an upgunned medium, which means that you're cheaper than you would be if you were a heavy tank with a heavy AT gun. So that's kind of a nice spot to be in. The problem is that you still cost just enough that you're still pretty expensive, right? It's about a quarter of your points at 1,250. It's almost a third of your points. It is over a quarter of your points at 1,000. So, to get this one tank, you're still paying a substantial amount. It's still representing a substantive amount of your force. It's not particularly great at removing infantry. It's obviously very good at removing light armor. Basically, everything in this list is going to be pretty good at removing light armor. But in terms of serious armor, if you were to go up against a damage value 10 tank, if you're at, standard range, 50% chance you get to make a wounding roll. Long range, possibly worse than that. And then, your Panzer Ace will help you on top of that. That's not very good odds when you think about it. It's really not very good odds for 270 points. So, it's tricky. Right? How do you want to weigh this and how do you gauge this? Its durability is fine. Damage value 9 is fantastic. The shirts and skirts I kind of use as it's nice to have, but obviously they're limited in terms of what their options are. It's not that they, basically give you armored all around, but on the sides. That's not how it works. It only works against those shaped charge style weapons like bazookas and Piats and Panzerschrecks and Panzerfaust and stuff like that, which is not horrible, but it's not the greatest. And again, from a mobility standpoint, it's not like it's particularly fast to make up for these things. It's just as fast as a Tiger II. It has the same mobility as a Tiger II. It just doesn't last as long. And so while I do think that it's probably a better option, I don't think it's as good as a number of the other options that are above it on this list. You then have the Panzer I. So you then have the Tiger I. This is the Panzer VI Tiger I at 396. It is still expensive, obviously, but where it makes up for this is that unlike the Panzer IV, it is fantastic for removing any sort of armor in the game. It is extremely durable at damage value 10+. Most weapons in the game are going to struggle at just trying to do anything above glancing damage to this, which is not the case for a damage value 9 chassis. And that bump in durability and that bump in firepower, with admittedly a reduction in cost, is what moves it above the Panzer IV. So if you're looking at a Panzer IV and you're already thinking about this, I'm not saying go ahead and dump an extra 150 points almost on a Panzer VI. But I am saying it's worth asking the question, hey, if I'm going to make an investment, do I want my investment to potentially be removed by bazookas? Or do I want to make it so that my investment is actually pretty safe against almost everything? And if the answer is, well, I'd prefer for it to be safer against everything, you might consider the Panzer VI instead. Again, because it's also, again, has that super heavy AT gun on a turret, you are wasting firepower potentially. Of course, it also means that if you happen to be running against another guy who's doing Panzer Ace and he's running damage value 9, 10, 11 tanks, you might find that this is useful to have. I do think personally the super heavy AT gun, and this is why it ends up in number 6 in the bottom half, I do think the super heavy AT gun is a little bit too many points to spend. It's a little bit of overkill. A heavy AT gun would probably do a slightly better job on a damage value 10 plus chassis. So I think you're paying a little too much here. But if I have to guess, I think it might actually be more effective than the Panzer IV on table because of the fact that it will live longer to be able to make the big hit. We then have the Jagdpanzer. The Jagdpanzer is trying to do, I think, too many things at once. So it's actually a nice thing to have near the middle. So first of all, it's a hull-mounted heavy AT gun, and I do think the heavy AT gun is the sweet spot. I do think that's roughly what you want to be aiming for, okay? And you can upgrade it to a super heavy AT gun for an extra 40 points if you wanted to. I didn't gauge it that way. The Jagdpanzer being damage value 9, but having that frontal armor of damage value 10, means it has the survivability of a Panzer VI, but it has the cost point that's only like 30 points more than a Panzer IV, which I think is really, really beneficial. I think that works out really, really well, and it means you hit this nice sweet spot. The problem, of course, is it's still not particularly great at removing infantry. It's fine against big armor. It's not necessarily the greatest at big armor, and as soon as you start adding an extra point by bumping it up to that super heavy AT gun, you lose a point in opportunity cost. So it doesn't actually change the ranking in terms of where it would fall. Durability is fine. It is quite advantageous for where it's at, and it is, again, not slow. It is actually quite fast. In fact, actually, most of the things on this list don't have slow, which is actually really nice. It does mean that, again, you're overpaying if they're only running light armor. So that's kind of one thing that does kind of push it a little bit further down. It's not optimized against every threat, but it is pretty good at a lot of different things. And I think the fact that, again, it does have to advance more, so it is going to miss more often, is potentially problematic for the Jagdpanzer. And it is relatively long. That is the other problem with the actual physical model. So actually getting turns in certain locations could be really difficult. It is the one problem with something like this over and against, say, like a Stug, which is a good bit shorter. But I do think that this at least gives you a decent starting point. You're effectively a Panzer IV chassis without the turret, and a pretty solid gun because of the fact that you were able to free up the space. You didn't have to work everything into a turret. We then have the Panzer V, which is the Panther. And I'll be honest, this one did surprise me a bit. It is mostly up here just because of math, okay? But fundamentally, this comes down to the fact that it is, again, it is a very, very big gun on a relatively small chassis. It's got that frontal armor that makes it pretty safe against most of the serious damage. It's got that damage value 9. It is effectively a slightly more expensive Jagdpanzer, but it has a turret, right? I mean, because if you look at the Jagdpanzer with the upgraded super heavy AT gun, it's only like 330 some odd points. It's only like, 10, 20 points less. And so because of that, yeah, in fact, actually, yeah, if you look at that, it becomes like 328, 338, and this is 358. So you're only 20 points off of where it was. But that 20 points is spent putting the main gun on a turret, making sure it has that coaxial machine gun to help out. And it shortens the size of the hull. So you can make pivots if you really need to an awful lot easier. And so honestly, as I'm kind of looking at it, this is actually a really, really good build. I don't think it's top 3. I don't necessarily think you should be running a Panther. But if one were to run a Panther and one were to run it as a Panzer Ace, I think it would actually perform pretty well. It would survive pretty decently. Sure, you'd be out quite a few points, but you're probably going to make at least half of your points back in armor that you're going to remove. And if you're up against a serious armored vehicle, you'll probably knock its lights out before it can knock you out, because it's going to be hitting against pretty high damage. You're going to be hitting pretty hard against it with that super heavy AT gun, and you might have spent less points on it. So on the whole, you could do a whole lot worse than taking a Panther. And the Panther, for all of the mechanical issues it may or may not have had during the war, is not slow, has no mobility penalties. It's still actually quite useful. But when we get to the top three, I think the top three are the ones you should actually be looking at. Like if you're looking at taking Panzer Ace, the top three are, in my book, even though the math is relatively close with all of the others, they're all within like 1 point of each other. I do think these are the three that you should be looking at. And to lead us into number three, we have the Hetzer. Now, the only reason why the Hetzer is where it is by comparison to the others is because it's a hull mounted gun on a weak sides damage value 9 chassis. This means it is less durable than everything else on this list. Everything else is at least damage value 9. This one is damage value 9, but basically damage value 8 if you're attacking it from the sides. Now, this is fair because the armor was relatively thin on the sides of the Hetzer. So, fair enough. It's not a problem there. But you do get, and this is nice, slight advantages that aren't really, they're not factored into the math because of how we did this. We didn't consider forward-facing machine guns versus 360-degree machine guns. It will do better removal and suppression against infantry than other tools. And the fact that it has a heavy anti-tank gun means it has a 2-inch HE template coming out from the gun. So even not having a coaxial machine gun, maybe that's actually okay. Having the machine gun that can fire at literally anything, plus a 2-inch template, nothing to sneeze at. You do have to advance, which makes it harder to hit. But you'll notice at 246 points, this is one of the cheapest options out there. This is one of the cheapest ways you can run Panzer Ace. And it still does pretty good infantry removal, pretty good armor removal from that heavy AT gun, and very good light armor removal. Sure, you're kind of wasting points if you're going up against a lot of damage value 8s, damage value 7s, but at the same time, you are still you're making sure that you have that extra room for potential, potential improvement, right? Skip that part. Sure, like you are potentially losing and paying some extra points if you end up running into, say, just damage value 7 plus tank gets, right? Because you're going to start at 6, you're going to go up to 7. But the truth is, if you're at long range, it's kind of nice to still be at 2s, right? It's that weird spot where you want to be able to do something against big, heavy tanks that cost closer to your costing point while still being able to remove. And so I think this is still quite effective. I think it will work out pretty well. You are still quite durable, all things considered, mid-range. You'll punch above where other people are punching, so I guess that's good. And again, not slow, which is nice. Number 2 on this list is the Stug III. Now, this is interesting because, of course, the Stug III is a relatively old vehicle for the purposes of World War II. It is based on the Panzer III chassis, but it's based on a tool that came out in 1939. It was used relatively early on in the war, and so it's iconic, right? I mean, you see Stugs on t-shirts, right? And honestly, I'm glad that it performed as well as it did because at 263 points, it is pretty cheap. It, again, also still has the benefit of that 360-degree anti-tank gun. It's still the heavy AT gun like we had with the Hetzer, and really the only major difference between the two is that it doesn't have thin sides, right? It is slightly more durable, slightly more reliable than your Hetzer. It's still pretty fast. It's pretty good at moving as regards tanks, and it will still do pretty good removal for you in all categories. And the nice thing too about Stug 3s, and one of the reasons why I highly recommend them, is not only do they perform really well on math, it is very common when you go to events that if prize support is being sent out by Rubicon miniatures, among all the Rubicon models that I have seen at tournaments, overwhelmingly, one of the most common ones you will find is a Stug 3. Okay? You will find it everywhere. You can get this, of course, in the German Grenadier starter box, which is one of, in my opinion, one of the best starter boxes you can buy, both in 2nd edition and in 3rd edition. It is a very iconic vehicle. It is relatively small from a frame perspective, so you can fit it almost anywhere on the board. It can, of course, move through difficult and rough terrain. It can ram into things because it's a tank. It's a nice all-purpose vehicle, and it's paying basically just enough points to do everything pretty well. I think there's one choice that does a better job, but on the whole, I think Stug does a really good job. It pains me a little bit that because it has to advance, it really can't do better. But from an actual points on the board perspective, it actually scored the highest at 21. We had a lot of 20s. This one technically eked it out at 21. I decided to drop it down because in my head, I said, you know what, even though the math is going to put it slightly above, I really don't think it's calculating for everything, including, of course, the fact that it might have to advance, so it might be hitting on 5s instead of hitting on 3s. And so I didn't want to necessarily reward that. But I do want to give the Stug some time to shine because it is a very good tank. And it's beaten out, in my mind, by the Panzer III late war variant. Now, to be clear, you cannot give this to the early war light AT gun, super cheap Panzer III. You have to put this on the damage value 9 plus medium AT gun Panzer III. Okay? Now, that being said, the medium AT gun, it is not the best for serious armor removal. So I want to be honest about this. If you know you're going up against like damage value 10 tanks, having Panzer Ace helps for sure because it makes you a +6. So now it's 50-50 odds at standard range, 33% odds that you at least get to wound on the damage chart if you're at long range, which is a good bit worse than a bunch of the others, right? So realize this is also, ironically, the lowest rating for serious armor removal that we have here. But its light armor removal is fantastic. It punches like a heavy tank because of the fact that it has Panzer Ace. It is still quite durable. It has the option for shirts and skirts if you want a bit of extra protection. It is quite inexpensive. This is less than a quarter of your points at 1,000 points. It's closer to like a fifth of your points if you're playing at 1250. And it's still quite mobile. So I think on the whole, what the Panzer would like to be is what the Panzer III is actually doing. It is a nice all-around tank. It has the turret to make sure that you don't have to move if you don't want to. It allows you to better take advantage of good positioning early on in the fight to really bring things home come the end of it. It is a good option for you to ambush. It is a very cheap, relatively inexpensive one that you could easily pair with other armored vehicles to make sure they're taking some of the fire off of this thing. It is decently good at removing infantry. It is very good at removing light armor. It is still pretty good and will do a comparable job on law of averages against larger armor. It is surprisingly durable for its size, and it is still quite mobile. It does really well in all categories. And so if you're asking me, hey, Aaron, I'm looking at taking a Panzer Ace style force, and I want to know what to take, my recommendation is going to be the Panzer III. If you can't take a Panzer III, maybe you want to use the models that you currently have, I'm going to recommend a Stug. If you want to go with something that maybe punches a little bit harder and maybe saves you a couple points here and there in some areas in order to make way for firepower, maybe take a Hetzer. But to be completely honest, I think those are the only three you should really be looking at. It's an interesting concept, though, as you consider it, because, again, it does really come down to what are you really trying to do, right? If you want a turret, effectively, that you can throw onto the battlefield and not worry that it's going to be destroyed, if you're looking to build a castle down, you're going to want to go lower on this list. You're going to want to go for something more like a Tiger II, right? I'd probably be okay, personally, with like a Panther or a Jagdpanzer instead of going all the way to a Tiger II. But I do think that, you know, if that's what's important to you, not losing the order dice, something you can park on an objective and you know you'll be at least contesting it at the end of the battle, if not actually controlling it yourself because you never lost it. I mean, I think something bigger that could be better for your strategy. I don't necessarily think it's going to win you games, but I think it might win you that objective for sure. So these are things at least just to think about, right? Things to consider as you're looking at stuff. I would be curious to see what your thoughts are. Was I being a little too fair to lighter tanks? Is the point of Panzer Ace to take something that's going to be able to survive? Are we walking into a situation where facing damage value 7 to 8 is more common, like we would in standard competitive play? Or are you assuming that because Panzer Ace is in play, especially if they know Panzer Ace is in play, that people might be taking bigger armor, in which case things like the Panzer III may not work as well? Let me know what you think down below, and I will see you next time.